That's a lot of intro videos for that. Thank you. Thank you everybody very much for coming. A nice little crew here that's interested in hopefully learning a little bit about beer and security operations and has some parallels between the two. I'm not really big on public speaking, so I like to hopefully make them a little bit interesting when I do, so I can actually be a little bit enthusiastic about it, because certain things are not really very sexy and fun to talk about. So decided to make this interesting and talk a little bit about home brewing, which is one of my passions. So we go into kind of who I am. Not like you need a picture there, you can see me, but I've been in cybersecurity for a little bit under 20 years. Started with a VAR called NCI. Don't exist anymore. They were bought by M&P, which is actually here, but Evgeny. I've pretty much done it all. So we were a managed security company. We did security operations. We did managed firewall, endpoint, consulting. We did assessments. We did everything. So I'm almost like a jack of all trades, master of none. Done a lot of work in data security, but now also doing work in security operations. The company I work with kind of focuses on security operations and how do you let companies get the most value out of their existing investments, not just ripping it out and providing something for nothing. My spare time, I do a lot more than this, but I do make beer. I don't do it as often as you think because beer takes a while to drink. I don't drink it constantly. I do like to smoke meats, which goes really well with the beer, and I do unfortunately have to work out a lot to compensate for both of those, or else I probably wouldn't look like I do today. I also, extremely nerdy point, had the biggest Lego set that they made. Up until about a year ago, they released the Eiffel Tower, which is massive. I have zero interest in it because it's quite frankly a very boring building to look at, but that was the Titanic, which is a much more cool set. Unfortunately, it's no longer the biggest, so I can't really tout that anymore. So a little bit about me. Gonna get right into it. I think what we're gonna do today is just talk about making beer. That's the main topic of this. Security operations is just kind of a fringe thing. We're gonna talk about how to boil water. That's a really important part of making beer. We're also gonna talk about yeast flatulence. This is an interesting topic, and when we get to it, it's kind of cool because there's a lot of really interesting things about yeast that make beer or anything you drink that's an alcoholic beverage. It really is the key ingredient to a lot of this stuff. And obviously, we're going to talk about security operations as well. I apologize for anybody that came to see a panel. I am just one person. There's not a whole bunch of chairs up here, and I will not sit because I think that's really weird. But yeah, we'll get into it. So at the beginning of beer making, we have water. That's really what it starts with. Water is your first ingredient, and if it's not good water, filtered water, pure water, spring water, it's not going to turn out well, right? You need it to be good. So security operations is kind of the same. If you didn't have alerts, if you didn't have noise, you're going to flow like water. You're going to have time for your team to be able to do all their projects, keep up with things, never have to worry about cyber attacks. Unfortunately, this isn't the way of things, right? We unfortunately do have issues with cyber attacks and alerts coming into environments, and we'll talk about how that affects this stuff. The first phase of brewing is mashing. So what this is basically steeping grains. Imagine you're making tea, and you want to be able to have the best tea. Well, you read the little tea packets, and it's going to tell you this is the temperature you need to steep it at, this is how long you need to steep it. This is the equivalent of that. It's just a lot more complex, right? So you're going to be looking at different types of grains, rye, wheats, and really what this is going to do is determine the type of beer that you're making. It's also going to determine the color, the flavor profile. Obviously, there's a lot more different flavors you add into these things, but it's really going to change what you're making in the end from that beer. Temperature control is really key as part of this. You typically, as you can see in the chart, I know it's really small, but you can see depending on the temperature that you're steeping this at, it's going to really change what that beer becomes. If you steep it too hot, it's going to actually release a bunch of additional flavors that get really gross, some sulfuric flavors, and you don't want to do that. So keeping an eye on it and babysitting it to make sure it's the right temperature is good. And if it's too cold, well, imagine you making a tea that you only steep at maybe 80 degrees Celsius. Well, it's going to be pretty gross because the tea leaves aren't steeping, right? So we want to make sure we do that. And timing is going to be critical. Steeping it at the right temperature for the right amount of time is then going to affect the overall flavor, and the outcome of this is going to be a really nice looking liquid that's going to be wort. And if you kind of compare this to security operations, I would kind of compare this as the beginning of where security operations was a long, long time ago. I started way back in like 2005. Back then, security operations was simple, right? There was firewalls and antivirus and IDS and IPS. It wasn't even built into the firewalls at that point for the most part. It was actually a separate appliance on the network. And things were simple with security operations. The attacks were not very complex. Phishing wasn't even really a big thing yet. People were not doing that, right? So your security operations team didn't have as much going in to the actual security operations as far as alerting and log sources, but unfortunately, they had a whole bunch of different tools to be able to then go pivot around, right? They didn't have one place to go to get the logs. They'd have to go to these different tools to triage the issues. So things weren't really crazy yet. If you needed to do a response, you go to either your antivirus, or more than likely you send Joe to go and grab that computer and get rid of it, right? Just image it and then start over again. Things didn't really proliferate very fast unless it was like a fast-moving worm in your environment, which nobody's used the word worm to really describe malware in probably at least 15 to 20 years. That's what they were back then. So at the very beginning, really we're talking about steeping, right? We're not boiling water. There's nothing crazy going on. On the beer side of things, you're adding in barley and rye and wheat, and you're really concerned about temperature control and timing. On the security operations side of things, you're looking at firewalls, antivirus, IPS. You're concerned about pivoting around these different things. But nothing was really crazy yet, right? We're not really too worried about overwhelming our team. We had good resources, but then we need to get into the more complex phases of brewing, which is the boil. So the boil is when the fun really starts to begin, and this is where the real flavors get put into beer. Hops are a wonderful thing. If you ever had a chance to smell a hop fresh off the hop vine, they're amazing. They smell fantastic. I grew some that unfortunately I killed because I'm a terrible gardener a couple of years ago, and just being able to pull them off and smell them and enjoy them is really, really wonderful. The hops is what changes beer significantly. You've got your base flavors from those grains, but now you add the hops, and depending on when you add the hops, it changes the taste entirely of your beer. A lot of people hate hoppy beer, and unfortunately, they don't hate hoppy beer, they hate beer that has too many hops that are put in too early. When you add hops to a beer really early during the boiling process, which usually takes about an hour, you get really bitter beer, and that's what most people associate hops with, is just that bitterness, like super, super bitter flavor and a long aftertaste. And that's really not the case for hops. Depending on when you add them, if you add them a little bit later on, you just get the flavor and you get the scent and the really nice aromas and smell out of it. So timing is super critical, and when you add it, and if you accidentally let that hop addition or the boil go long, 20 minutes, let's say, doesn't seem like a huge deal, but all of those hops that were in there that were gonna give you scent and all that delicious flavor are now ruined and are now adding a whole bunch of extra bitterness to your beer, which is now, it's still beer, but it's not what you were planning to make. There's lots of additives that go into this, so more and more stuff going into this rapidly boiling pot, and I don't know if at the back you can play the video. It's not really super critical, but you can kind of see what it looks like. See if it works. The fun thing about brewing beer, during the mash, it's not too bad, but you can see on the top, that's actually hops that are in the beer. So you're basically drinking what looks like a witch's cauldron of rather strange and kind of disgusting stuff within this. And then when we get into what yeast does, it's even more interesting. There we go. Yeah, just click the play button at the bottom there. There you go. So super, super cool. You're literally brewing. It's like, and I'll get into it at the end, but that's kind of where this stuff started, was way, way back a long time ago. And witches' cauldrons. Boilovers are a major issue. When you add a whole bunch of stuff to boiling water at once, I'm sure we've all cooked and thrown pasta into something, yeah, there can be major issues. So you need to be really careful during this whole process. If you cover the beer, it's actually going to cause condensation on the top of the lid, and all that condensation drips back in, and it's actually got sulfur in it, which is obviously not really something that you want to drink. So you really need to be really, really careful during this phase. And set lots of timers. So usually there's a very specific recipe that says, add this hop at 50 minutes in the boil, add this hop with 10 minutes left. Sometimes there's something called a whirlpool hop that I have on there. That's where you actually mix it like you're mixing a big pot at the very end of the boil for 10, 15 minutes while those hops just sitting there. So it's pretty cool. And so to kind of parallel this to security operations, you know, oh, it actually did work, great. I call it the technology evolution, but it's just a made-up term. It's basically when everything started to change with security operations and with security in general, which is just more technology equals more problems, right? SIM came around, and at the beginning, quite frankly, SIM was just a large repository for your logs that you could store data in to be able to collect them. That was pretty much it. You go there and you search every once in a while. There wasn't a lot of detections happening, but like, hopefully they're okay. And that's really the main purpose of it, right? We needed to be able to build some kind of detections around all those different logs to be able to make use of them, but then who's going to do that? Nobody knew how to do that in a SIM. SIMs were brand new. So major issues and some new kind of challenges in the security operations there. Endpoint detection. We moved from not even heuristic-based antivirus, just signature-based antivirus to all of a sudden doing super advanced endpoint detections based on heuristics and virtualization and blacklisting and whitelisting and now crowdsourcing, like really complex stuff that's obviously revolutionized our ability to stop attacks on the endpoint. But who else is going to manage that, right? There's more complexity, and now another alert source outside of the SIM, because the endpoint detections don't usually alert through the SIM. That's coming directly to you, right? Threat intelligence platforms. Now we've got a whole bunch of information on attacks that are going on, IOCs. We want to understand what's going on so we can proactively block those in our firewall and set up special lists in the SIM so that we can start to block that stuff as well. We've got cloud platforms and technologies, like who's going to learn how to do this? We're just going to jump right in and just throw everything out to the cloud, like obviously we did during COVID. Everybody did that, and now how do we detect attacks out there? Are we going to use the built-in tools? Or are we going to use something else? And now everybody's finally realizing that maybe my other networks need some protections too. The number of manufacturing firms I talk to, and there's lots of different actually companies, even like universities that I talk to that now are worried about protecting their OT networks, right? Like stamping machines and temperature control for food processing. How do we protect that? That could ruin our business if somebody attacks that, and how do we get logs and events out of that? And obviously IoT. We don't want people turning off our lights all of a sudden when we're in the middle of a presentation. So security operations is getting much more overwhelming. This is why I kind of equate this to the boil. Things are very extreme, right? You stick your hand in the security operations boiling bucket and you're gonna get burned. There's way too many tools, there's way too much to learn, and there's way too many alerts coming from all these different sources for us to be able to deal with them. So throwing this up there, we've got lots of hops going into the boil. We've got lots of SIM sources going into the boil as far as where our security operations kind of aligns with that. We've got major issues with beer making, with boil overs. I don't want to make a huge mess. If you don't babysit it and hop order things properly, you're going to have major issues with what your beer tastes like. And the worst thing you can do is make a beer that doesn't taste good, right? On the security operations side of things, way too many tools. Unfortunately, a lack of skills, which there's not a single company you can go into that says they wouldn't want more people, right? There's just more and more. Everybody wants more people to be able to come and work with them. And the reason is that there's team overload. All those alerts, having to pivot around, having to respond to things, modify detections. People can't keep skilled resources because they're bored. They don't want to deal with having to triage alerts, right? They don't want to have to go to the next phase, which is going to equate to investigations, but on the beer side of things is fermentation. So this is by far the coolest phase of making beer. If you've ever seen yeast at work, it's a super, super, super cool thing. Yeah, you go ahead and play it. Unfortunately, there's no audio, but suffice it to say this is very active. Again, if you're drinking beer, this is what you're drinking. Can anybody tell me what is the yeast doing? Anybody ever play with beer in the past or understand this kind of stuff?
Just drink the beer.
Sorry?
Just drink the beer.
Just drink the beer and don't worry about it. Yeah, nobody's gonna drink beer at the gala tonight because of this. So basically the bubbles they're basically yeast fart. It's carbon dioxide. It's actually how you carbonate beer in bottles as well. But what it's doing is it's eating the sugars. From all those grains that you added at the very beginning, it's eating the sugars, and it is, like a human, has waste from that. It's creating carbon dioxide and it's creating alcohol. Two different things. Carbon dioxide comes out and the alcohol stays in the beer. So that is where the alcohol comes from in your beer. So during the fermentation phase, we can't very well throw yeast into a boiling vat of beer. That's not going to work very well. It's going to kill it. So we need to cool it down, and because of that, there's extreme diligence required in this phase. By far, the most difficult phase and the easiest one to screw up, because if there's even one foreign piece of bacteria or foreign yeast or a virus or anything like that, it's going to infect the beer, and that is going to take over and start eating all the sugars and starting to give its own flavor to it, which you can imagine if you get some random yeast or fungus from a mushroom in your lawn in this, it's not going to taste like beer. It's going to taste probably really disgusting, right? So you have to basically sanitize everything you touch, including yourself, through this whole process to make sure you don't infect the beer. Once it's cooled, we transfer this into a carboy, which is those containers that you saw there, big glass containers that can take a lot of pressure. Because I have definitely, you saw that the one that had like the tube coming out of it, that's called a blow-off valve. If you don't do that, and it's a very active yeast, it will literally blow the top of the carboy off and hit your ceiling, which did happen to me once and was not a very fun cleanup job. So yeah, we talked about what the yeast is doing, but it is basically eating, and it is creating what you're going to enjoy in that beer. Some hop-forward editions will get hops at the end of this as well. So they're not even getting boiled, they're getting put in, and they're just giving you lots of really good scents as well. So, as I mentioned before, I kind of equate this to the investigation phase. It's all about skills, it's all about process, and it's all about procedure. If you don't follow processes, you're going to screw up your investigation. You're going to end up with something that's completely wrong. You have to be very, very diligent through this process to make sure that you're getting an accurate investigation. Very, very specific skills are required. If you just hire a bunch of people that don't really have a lot of skills around things like detection building, incident handling, threat hunting, and threat intelligence, you're not going to get good outcomes out of those investigations, right? And what that means is that you need people that can follow a very consistent methodology so that two people on your team, completely different people that have not looked at each other's notes, will follow the same investigation workflow and end up with the same result, right? So you are confident that that they're being thorough, and that is the actual result that they want, and that's what happened in this particular scenario, this incident, this attack, whatever it happens to be. If you don't do that, what ends up happening is you get really fragmented and disjointed investigations. You don't end up having faith in your team, and unfortunately, if that happens, then you're at risk, right? Because you don't know whether or not you actually cleaned out that attacker or that virus or that malware or that advanced persistent threat. It could still be in your environment. Automation is super key. A lot of people investing in SOAR technologies, super expensive, a very quick way to add $150,000 to your budget and your expenses. But unfortunately, even with those, most people I talk to that have a SOAR say that they really only use it for 1, maybe 2 or 3 playbooks, and usually not automation, right? So it's big issues with spending a lot of money, but not getting a lot of value out of the money you're putting into your investments. Efficacy itself becomes tedious. I talked to a bunch of customers actually recently that went through investigations, and it was only when they had to do investigations because of ransomware or some kind of malware that they realized that they were missing the events they needed to be able to actually do the investigation. So now they have to go back, they have to get their engineers to change how their SIM is working, they need to go and change their products to make sure they're logging, make sure the logging levels are set up appropriately. How do you actually watch that and make sure it's continually working properly all the time? And how do you tweak false positives, tuning all these different rules, the EDR and the SIM, and what are we missing at any given time, right? So it's all about really being very, very persistent and very, very on the ball with the skills, the process, and the procedures around security operations. And obviously having a leader for your security operations team that can ensure your team is doing that. That's obviously a critical aspect of it. And this is really where burnout really starts to set in. Again, the biggest area we find people burnout of security operations is not because there's too many alerts necessarily. It's because they're investigating alerts that are repetitive and that look the same every time. Nobody's tuning the false positives because they don't know how. I talk to customers that say they know they have false positives. Why don't you tune them? We don't have time. The answer is they really don't know how to do it properly, right? They weren't sent to school to go learn how to tune detections on this particular SIM or within this EDR. They don't really know how to do it, right? They need somebody to help them with that. So getting pretty close to the final stage, we've made beer basically at this point. There's a lot of complexity both on the fermentation side of things as well as on the detection, investigation, and response side of things, right? We have to do tuning, there's log efficacy, there's automations that are required, and there's tons of inconsistency issues. There's lots of single points of failures when it comes to security operations. If you miss one log source when you're doing an investigation, well, now you don't know that they pivoted to a bunch of other servers, right? That's a critical aspect, and you just missed it because you weren't following some kind of consistent playbook. And there's lots of expensive automation tools as well. So very similar to kind of the fermentation phase. Again, this is all very rough, so hopefully it kind of makes sense, but extreme diligence is required. You're really protecting your crown jewels, which is your beer at this point, and temperature control is really critical. Final phase, you can see how dirty that carboy is. Yes, that is basically what's going to get drank. It does get kind of filtered, though. You don't drink the gross stuff, and it is really gross, I will tell you that. It is beer at this point. When you take it out of that carboy, you can actually drink it, and it tastes good. It's just not carbonated. So it's like drinking flat beer. Not exactly very fun. So because we're going from the carboy into, in this case, a keg or into bottles, and you're going through a siphon, you've got to make sure that your diligence continues, right? You have to make sure that things are getting sanitized, or else you're going to infect it. And even though it's sitting in a fridge, the infection will spread, and it will start to taste disgusting. Measurement is kind of key at this phase. So again, we talked about the yeast is eating the sugars, right? So we need to measure the sugars before we actually start to do the fermentation process, and then we measure the sugars after the fermentation process. What that equals is a number, and you do a small calculation, and that tells you what the alcohol by volume is. So it tells you basically how much alcohol is in this beer. That's a pretty critical thing to measure and not mess up, right? Imagine you have a bunch of friends over, and you want to, drink some of your new beer. You're all have empty stomachs, but it's fine. It's only a 4% beer. Well, turns out it was a 7.5% beer, and now you've got a whole bunch of sick friends that are, calling up the pizza place because they need food in them immediately. So pretty critical. Maybe not as critical as some security operations problems, but human life. Clarity also. So one thing I'm just getting into is filtering, being able to get rid of some of the aspects and being able to kind of see through the noise and be able to see a nice crystal clear beer. So filtering things and making sure that the clarity of the beer is really nice is obviously really critical as well. And as I mentioned before, inaccurate measurements can spell, obviously, massive issues. Carbonation is critical, so it's a little easier with kegging. With kegging, it's basically you're force carbonating the beer, so you really don't have to worry too much. When you're bottling, you actually add sugar to the beer to reactivate the yeast, and then it carbonates in the actual bottle. Because the carbon dioxide doesn't have anywhere to go, it carbonates the beer. So it's a lot more work. You have to sanitize all of the bottles, but obviously it's a lot cheaper. You don't have to buy a keg fridge, you don't have to buy kegs, you don't have to learn a whole bunch of new skills. I have accidentally, pretty sure I didn't add the priming sugar once to a grapefruit IPA. Unfortunately, didn't turn out great because of that. It was very flat. I did try putting it in a soda stream, and it did work. However, it did also explode and make quite the mess in my house. So we took it outside and did a few more like that. It was pretty fun, but yeah, if you make a mistake and you forget something, it can have, unfortunately, devastating effects on your beer. Nobody wants to drink flat grapefruit IPA, especially this grapefruit IPA. You can imagine it did not taste good flat. Measurement and maintenance of security operations is kind of the same, right? Nobody really knows how to do this properly. And typically the problem is that nobody really has a simplified view of all of that stuff. You've got way too many things to look at. The people that you're trying to tell this to are typically your boss, your executives, your stakeholders. They want to understand what's the risk to the business. How well are we doing? Are we getting value out of our existing investments? How quickly are we stopping threats, and how many threats are there, right? This is all justifying the spend, basically, for security operations. If you can't tell them you're getting value out of the money you're spending and your people are staying busy because you're actually being attacked and nothing's happening and nothing bad is happening, well, are you going to get more money for next year's budget? Maybe, maybe not, right? Very, very concerning. They're all very subjective, really difficult to track. As I mentioned, we've got so many different tools. We've got a SIM, it can get us some reports. We've got an EDR. How do I combine that with the reports? Maybe we've got an MDR service as well. Who knows? How do you get those all into one place and be able to then track and measure all that appropriately and be able to show value for everything? You've got also like ticketing and tooling systems, right? We've got lots of different detections as well. How do you map how well your detections are doing in an environment? Everybody looks to MITRE to map that. But how do you say you're doing well against MITRE? All you get is, this attack has to do with these MITRE attacks. Okay, well, am I covering all the MITRE attack methodologies, all the TTPs? I don't know. Like, does my SIM map to that? Does my EDR map to that? How do you combine all that and be able to show that you're actually providing full coverage to your organization? It's really, really hard. And unfortunately, your staff, who has to go gather that because you just asked for it, are so busy with the alerting that they can't really go and get that for you, right? They don't even understand where to go. Or if they do have to go get it, it takes them literally 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hours, if not days or weeks, to be able to do it, and quite possibly professional services time from somebody. So we've reached the end of the beer making process. We've measured our beer. It's delicious. Lots of diligence required in that phase. It's obviously something we want to be really concerned with. And we have kind of gone through detection. We've gone through investigation, detection, response. We've also gone through now the maintenance and measurement of our security operations. All of these have lots of issues across them. All of them have various ways to solve them, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the solutions to the problems right now. I'm sure you guys want me to tell you some solutions, not just the problems themselves. One solution on the brewing side, I'm always going to talk about brewing first, is you get a brewing system. So this is a brewing system that will basically take over the mashing and the boiling phase for you, right? So one system to kind of rule it all. It's Wi-Fi enabled. You can get updates on your phone that tell you when you actually need to go add something to it. And you basically just sit back and relax. But you can't leave the house. You can watch your favorite TV show, sure. You don't have to stand there and make sure it's not boiling over, but you can't go anywhere. You can't do anything. You still need lots of diligence around it. You need to go and add something. You need to go and take out the mashing stuff and switch over the water, and there's other stuff you have to do as well, but we're not going to make this too in-depth. And unfortunately, everything after the boil, you still have to do. You still have to do the fermentation of the carboy. You can't ferment it in that, unfortunately. They do sell a fermentation chamber, but it's just like a carboy. It's just bigger and fancier and more expensive. So it doesn't get rid of all of the problem. You're just basically automating, with a lot of your own input, unfortunately, part of the process. I kind of equate this. Does anybody have any guesses as to what I equate this to on the security operations side of things? Evgeny, you're nodding your head. Any guess? Cool. I have a slide for that, kind of. So it's a little bit different than that. I'm kind of just taking part of your problem and kind of taking it and taking it away from you. But you still have a lot of work to do. And the way I look at that is like MDR. Classically, MDR, if you look at the bottom left there, is going to be through an EDR provider, right? They're taking over the alerting and the management of your EDR alerts, but you still have your own SIM to deal with. We do see a lot of MDRs that also have their own SIM. Right? You've got your SIM on-prem still. You're not going to trust them with your SIM necessarily, but you send them a lot of your different logs, and they'll manage that, but then you still have to manage your EDR and all of your other technologies. And unfortunately, what this means is that you don't really get use of your existing investments, or you're losing use of some of them, and they don't really integrate across the rest of your ecosystem. Right? So you just get a little bit. What ends up happening for most of these is that they end up installing sensors and agents to get data out into their environment. So because they can't really use any of your technologies, they're just taking data out of those technologies. They're taking data from the network because they can't get it out of the technologies and just shipping it over to their environment, right? They can't go and investigate anything in there. They can't do automations in any of your technologies. They're basically just telling you, hey, we saw this alert. It came from this machine. Go ahead and take a look at it, right? And unfortunately, a lot of the time, what they're actually doing on the back end, and this isn't everybody, is very black box, right? You don't really know what's actually going. What does their methodology look like as far as investigations? What kind of events were they triggering this off of? What are the logs associated with it? I want to be able to track that stuff down, especially within an actual investigation. What happens most of the time is that they send you the alert, and then you go and investigate it further to get to the point of actually ending the incident, which is great. There's lots of organizations that need help with something like this, and this are kind of the level of maturity that would use an MDR to be able to manage their security operations. And it's not to say an MDR can't coincide with other types of security operations frameworks as well, or with your security operations team. So that's one approach, not necessarily perfect, definitely has its place in security operations. Another approach to beer is just buy it from the store. Don't try and make your beer. You don't need to make your friends go blind. This is definitely the best option for some people. A lot of stores carry great beer, but then the problem is you're not really brewing, right? So all that technology, all that, the team that you just invested in, the sim, all these things are now worthless, right? You just put all this money into building this beautiful, this beautiful beer making business for yourself, and you've just gotten rid of it. So the way I kind of equate that is outsourcing things, right? So MSSPs in a perspective, but outsourcing your security operations. Typically what happens is they're going to manage your EDR and manage your SIM, or one or the other, right? So you kind of lose control of those things. And the main reason for that is that most outsourced SOCs, most outsourced MSSP kind of operations don't really support a lot of different technologies. So yes, if you want to come to us, we can manage your SOC, we can do all that for you, but you need to pump all your logs into our SIM, and this is the one that we support, and that's the only one. So you're going to have to get rid of that one you have. And 2 years down the road, you decide, my business analytics team would really like to get access to a lot of our operational data to be able to do reporting and be able to crunch numbers. Well, you can't, because guess what? A, you don't have access to do that, and B, the SIM we're running doesn't really support it because it's the cheapest one we could find, right? Which is more often the truth. Right, so you're not flexible. You can't really change your tools. You can't really pivot. You can't really change what's kind of going on in your environment. They can't typically get really much into actually automating and using your environment outside of those two different tools. So yes, they're integrate with your SIM and your EDR, but then what about connecting to my firewalls, right? There's some MSPs for sure that can manage your firewalls and maybe they'll integrate that. What we're finding more often than not is that they really focus on the core technologies for security operations. And they're not going to then go and connect to your cloud technologies, your firewalls. Cloud technologies is a huge one. I hear constantly that, yeah, we've got so-and-so firm or so-and-so, outsourced SOC, but they lack cloud support. They're great at on-prem stuff, but I've got AWS CloudTrail. They don't know how to use it. They don't know how to connect to it. They're asking me what I should do with it. Well, you're our providers. Why are you asking me what we should do with it? You should be telling me what I should be doing with this, right? Giving me the advice to be able to do that. Metrics and reporting is a concern like anywhere you go. Unfortunately, they're limited to the same tools you have. Again, they're just managing a SIM or an EDR, and maybe they have a ticketing system. So you're going to get some metrics about how many logs and events and things like that, but to really understand all of your security operations, you still need to now figure out the metrics across all of these different types of tools and devices. And you're going to basically lose visibility into security operations. It's not yours anymore. They're running it for you. You want to understand how they're running it, what methodologies they're using, good luck. That's just not something you can do with this model, right? They'll bring you into a nice shiny room and they'll tell you all these fancy things, but on a day-to-day basis, can you actually see how it's working? The answer is no. Lots of people using that model, though. Again, not going to say it's terrible. If you don't have a security operations platform at all today, or people, it's a great model, right? You can get a full security operations team very, very, very quickly. Before we talk about a little bit better, or at least my idea of what a better solution is, there's some other scenarios I just want to walk through. Joint brewing. You've got friends that also like to brew beer. Super cool. Let's put our recipes together and make a really cool product, and we'll drink it together, and all will be merry. We can have lots of friends. Unfortunately, it requires a lot of planning. You're putting a whole bunch of different kinds of hops together. You're putting a whole bunch of different kinds of timings and grains. You can't just mash it all together and expect it to work out. You need to actually plan for that, and you need to focus on how it's going to kind of be achieved, right? What's the target alcohol level? What are the temperatures and all that kind of stuff? So it's not super, super simple. What I equate that to in the security operations world is mergers and acquisition. You want to go buy a company. Fun. How do you manage their risk and security operations? You have Splunk or Sentinel. They have QRadar or Devo. You don't know how to use that. Your MSSP doesn't support that. How do you go and acquire this company, and instead of having to actually move them fully onto all your technology before you understand their risk and deal with security operations, how are you supposed to actually manage the risk and deal with all their alerting, right? It's very, very difficult. They've got different firewalls, different EDR, different clouds. They might be on GCP. Well, that's a completely different beast. Like, you only use Azure today. So it's a big issue. How do you manage that risk? How are you able to go and actually say that the company's secure that you're acquiring, right, very early on in the process? So again, most organizations will go through the painstaking process, and it usually takes 1 to 2 years for large organizations like bank size to actually go through the process of onboarding them into their technology. More often than not, they end up still completely segregated and running on their own technology with their own separate security operations teams, reporting completely separately, and it's really hard to boil that stuff up and have kind of that single point of visibility. Another thing, brewing something else. I put cider because it's a cool picture, but could be whiskey. Whiskey's super popular for brewing. Lots of people doing that. It's called stilling the whiskey. How hard could that really be? Well, the fact is it's very different, right? You can't just start making cider the same way you would make beer. Good luck fitting the apples into the carboy. It just doesn't work that way. It's not like hops. This is a funny story. This is actually how I kind of got into, I always liked beer, but I got into brewing because there's a TV show, and the name escapes me right now. It's about a bunch of people that go and rob a bank. And the guy was talking about his cover story, which was brewing cider. Somebody will probably know the name of this. He makes cider. And he was talking about the science behind it and how much effort there is and the timing and so many different processes and the types of apples that go into it and where they're from in the world changes the flavor profile. And I found it fascinating that there's that much science and just kind of information in association with such a simple drink, which is just fermented apples in reality. So I looked into beer and how difficult it would be to be able to make beer and realized it's very similar and kind of got me into the brewing process. And I was just like, one day I bought a book and away I go, just started doing it. And that's really the best way to do it if anybody does want to get in. Buy a book. I've got a picture of a book at the end, and just try it. You just got to buy a big kit and go for it. Anyway, back to the point. So we need to pivot our skills. We need to learn new skills. Brewing beer and brewing cider are not the same thing. It's going to be a disaster until we adapt it. But we could always just throw ourselves out there and start making cider without really thinking about it and planning of it, which is kind of what I equate to the cloud journey, which is what we all did. Not everybody, but a lot of people over the last few years. We all just threw ourselves out there, and now we're kind of scrambling back and trying to figure out, okay, well, I've got this SIM, but my cloud provider has this data lake or this SIM. Like, how can I now use those, and how can I do detections across them? It's not easy to do the same detections in the cloud as you're doing on-prem. What do? Do we use two different SIMs? Do we use two different data lake and a SIM? How do we build detections in those? How do we pivot across them? There's a lot of really unique challenges, and costing is probably one of the biggest. Like, you now have to pay for ingress costs, egress costs, storage costs, different levels of storage. You can get basic storage for free, but then if you want to actually use the logs and do correlations, you have to pay for more. So it's extremely difficult across all these different platforms, and oftentimes most organizations don't have just one. Almost everybody has Azure, unfortunately, or fortunately, because that's just what you need to have. But a lot of people use AWS for different things, web services, S3, whatever it happens to be. How do you connect to both of those and do security operations across that, plus your on-prem environment, plus all your mobile workforce? It becomes very, very difficult. So the unique solution, or kind of the solution that I think is probably the best one to look at on the brewing side, is professional brewing, is what I like to call it. And no, I'm not calling myself a professional brewer. I just couldn't find a good stock picture of somebody that looked like a professional brewer. I should put a chef or something. That would have been cool. So what is this to me? This is the equivalent of getting a professional brewer and having them make your beer for you. Still your recipe, right? It's still all your equipment, all your ingredients. You buy the ingredients, you say, here you go, make this beer for me. I'm going to enjoy it in 3-4 weeks. So you can go and do whatever you want. I put Formula One. I'm a big fan of that as well. Not a big fan of golfing. I like to drink, and I will play, but usually I'm just buying drinks for the golf carts. The pro manages that entire process. They do all the measurements, right? They tell you what's going on with the beer, so you don't have to worry about it. They get an accurate measurement every single time. And the cool thing is that they can also brew whiskey, right? They can brew cider. They need to do all these different things. They can also go and merge and merge your recipes with your friends. So again, that joint brewing project. Your friend's brewing his beer. He's maybe a little bit better than you. You take his recipe, you give it to your professional brewer, and he combines that to make an actual recipe. This is literally the equivalent of a lot of people who start breweries. Most of them don't brew their own beer when they start the brewery. It's a lot different, it's a lot bigger, and unfortunately, they don't really want to be doing that. They loved brewing beer when it was in their basement, which in my case is in my basement. But when you take it out of that and you start brewing beer on a large scale where you're selling it to the LCBO or the beer store, it's not really as much fun anymore. They will hire a brewmaster to go and do that for them, right? And so that's the equivalent of exactly what this is. And so it kind of does exist for security operations, but the overall picture of that would be to have somebody manage your SIM, your EDR, your log sources, be able to connect to all your different technologies in your environment to be able to actually triage and gather data from all these different technologies, right? So what you're looking at is a way to have a security partnership with somebody that helps basically reduce the overall noise in your environment, right? Your team doesn't have to deal with the mundane tasks anymore, the tuning, the log efficacy issues, because they're connected to your technologies in your environment. Automation and response is a lot more effective. Before, where maybe you could, with your EDR vendor, go and isolate a host, now you can disable users. You can block them on a NAC solution. You can block them on the firewall, in CASB solutions, in cloud IDS, IPS, whatever it needs to be, because they're actually connected to all these different locations. And really what you're trying to get to is a point where this kind of vendor X or security partner is able to give you visibility into this whole process. It's all for naught if you can't understand what's going on with this partnership. You can actually see into the platform. You can do reporting real time on how is my security operations today. What kind of detections do I have built across my entire security stack, and what does that look like? What are the metrics on that? How does that map to MITRE? Right? And have those ready at your fingertips so when the board members call you, or your boss or your CEO calls you and says, hey, I need to present to the board tomorrow, can you tell me how we're doing for security operations? They're not going to ask you a specific question because quite frankly, they don't know. You need to be able to give them data that's at your fingertips. And the equivalent, again, it's a professional team at your disposal, right? They're ready to go. They're there when you need them. And the best part about this is that because they support all different kinds of SIMs and EDRs and firewalls and cloud technologies, you're not really stuck in a certain solution. You can grow and you can expand and you can be agile. There's lots of organizations that don't want to use the same SIM for 10 years. They want to change, right? New SIMs are coming out all the time, especially cloud-native SIMs with really cool technologies, with UEBA built right into them. You can have that, which also means that for mergers and acquisitions, you've got a team and a partnership already in place that allows you to onboard those mergers and acquisitions very quickly because they already support that other, let's say it's Azure or AWS. They already support that other SIM, that firewall, and have integrations into them. So you don't have to worry about there being a 1 to 2 year lag time in onboarding these technologies into your environment. You can start supporting them immediately. And maybe you'll have multi-tenancy support so you can actually see the security operations and do reporting in the security operations as well. And cloud, I won't forget about that. The ability to connect out and actually see all the different cloud environments. Let's say you have a SIM on-prem. Say you have a SIM in Azure as well. Well, what happens if you're also running an AWS and you're using CloudTrail to store tons of operational data that would be super useful for data stitching and threat hunting? You want a security partner, 1 minute. You want a security partner that is going to be able to help with all that, right? Integrate with all of those different solutions, and it does exist. Key takeaways as I kind of wrap things up. Homebrewing is awesome. I do encourage, if anybody's in here specifically to hear about homebrewing, I'm not sure, give it a try. I hope it didn't scare you off. It is a lot, especially the process. You will make mistakes in the first time you brew. I guarantee it. The very first time I brewed a New England IPA, which is probably one of the hardest beers to brew. There's a lot of stuff going into it, and it turned out great. And I definitely screwed it up. So it was not supposed to be only like 4.5%. It was supposed to be like 7. But it turned out great and it tasted good. Yeast is awesome. It's actually probably one of the funnest things to watch when it's actually brewing. And obviously beer is fun and delicious. Security operations side of things, security operations teams are at a boiling point, right? Everybody is ready for some kind of change. Lots of people have adapted MDRs to kind of solve the problem, brought on MSSPs, outsourced their security operations somewhere else. Not everything's perfect. If to kind of even just take it to the very last point, Sometimes that's not perfect for everybody. If you find yourself in a position where it's not, and MSSPs and MDRs, there are different solutions that will support your environment, allow for that agility within the organization, and really focus on making security operations a boon to the business, right? Allowing security operations to make the business more agile and change and make the business actually run better, right? Which is not something that, unfortunately, a lot of security operations partnerships can do, but it does exist. That's it for me. Please, by all means, you can scan the QR code that will just basically take you to my LinkedIn, so you can add me on there. The book, I actually bought multiple books. The first one was terrible. It was far too sciencey. I had no interest in learning beer to that extent. How to Brew was a great one. It started with just getting you into, here's the first steps you need to make beer. Don't make it complex. Buy this kit, do this thing, use this recipe, and you can get yourself some really good beer. So, sorry? Yeah, you can call me if you want. Yeah, you have to help, though. I'll be the professional brewer. If there's any women that want to get into brewing, whether it's beer or whiskey or anything with alcohol in it, basically, the Pink Boot Society is a really cool organization that's trying to get women back into brewing more. There's actually quite a few master brewers now that are women. If you look into the history of brewing, women actually started with brewing. They were the brewmasters way back in the day. You can imagine women mixing large amounts of beer in large cauldrons. You can kind of see where that went. Unfortunately, that's why they're not in brewing anymore, but they are getting back into it now. You can Google that. I wasn't prepared to talk about that at this event, but yeah, it's a super cool history with brewing, and I'm really happy to see lots more women getting into it. Instagram in itself is a great kind of proof to that, and the number of people that are in it, and you can just search up brewing and brewmasters. So super cool. Happy to answer any questions, if there's any questions about security operations or brewing beer, if you have any. No. All right. Thank you very much, then.